Before I submit work, I read through my work for legibility. So I'm looking to see if it makes sense at the level of the sentence, and then I read through for detail. I have a tendency to bounce really quickly from one idea to the next. And so my editing prior to submission is for richness of detail. Are there places where I can try to offer more visual or ambient description? If so, I try to amplify those, round them out before I submit it. But my first line of defense is to read through and look for typos and see if it makes sense at the level of the sentence.
First of all, I read and reread, hoping that the layers of the piece are clear to me before I begin making revisions or suggestions. I also start by asking myself questions that foreground what I put in my queries, positioning myself first as a reader and what pulls my attention and what I'm curious to have clarified or perhaps know more about. I've mostly asked questions. I don't claim to have any answers to these questions because the author has those and has likely considered some of the things that I've brought up. But I tend to ask questions that have a bit of nuance built in so that the author can flesh out or excavate what's already there.
On Boredom is an essay that explores gradations of boredom, mothering, caregiving, and experiences of moods that we might categorize as depression. When I try to recall the boredom and aimlessness of childhood, I find mostly hazy memories hovering on the horizon of my synapses. The feeling of sun through a screened window, the smell of ancient blankets spread out over chairs to make a fort, cicadas, June bugs hitting the screen, the smell of grass dying in the sun. What is it about expansive time and summer? School, probably. Almost always I am alone in these memories. There is never television. There are often books which I have finished, and the feeling of almost sleep or near frustration. As I enter my 40th year, I find myself thinking of these moments more and more. This is not nostalgia. It is something else. I think it has to do with time. Now let's imagine that other kinds of boredom can be interesting. Take, for example, the boredom of ordinary devotion in Maggie Nelson's terms. I think this, too, has to do with time. The time of rocking, of holding, of the crick in the neck that comes from falling asleep that way, of the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 count and slow breath before going again for the 5th time to soothe, of remembering one's own desire to be soothed, of a toddler's incessant questions, of hoping for 10, just 10 minutes alone and then getting them and being at a loss. But also, this is about the familiar shape of a day, of a life I built, of how boring these things are as subjects, how banal, or possibly that they are simply boring to others, of how, perhaps, there are gradations of boredom and not all of them are negative, of how, when one is interested in these subjects, in these creatures and their growing habits, one becomes pigeonholed as that kind of writer.
In Erin's first paragraph, I found myself sort of hooked by the formulation of different sentences. I asked her about a couple of moments of repetition with screens, the smell of things, and the time of day when June bugs come out. So we're sort of given this setting of the interiority of a home, these ancient blankets, these forts, and sunlight pooling in through the windows. And June bugs tend to come out at night. And so that was something that I just wanted to keep us very focused in the moment, perhaps.
Allison's comments made me able to see the kind of repetitions and kind of bugbears in my speech that I return to over and over again. One of the ways that I write first drafts is to catalog sentences, to almost pile a list of similar things on top of each other and see what sticks. And sometimes I lose relationship to time or fact, including when June bugs arrive. So I was thinking I'm thinking in this paragraph of two very specific places and locations of where heat and boredom happened. One is on the Naugahyde couch on the porch of my parents' house in rural Ontario. But the second is on the porch of a house that I spent a deal of time growing up in rural North Carolina, where June bugs show up all the time, and not just at night, but sort of in the late afternoon in the haziness. And so those two times kind of collapsed on each other, and I didn't pay any attention to it. So it's a moment in which I really started in the editorial process, because it's the first paragraph, to totally trust Allison in terms of the ways in which she was engaging, not just with the craft of what was happening, but the fact checking as well, which is something that I actually care a great deal about.
In the second paragraph, where Erin brings in the ordinary devotion, I mean, I'm a huge Maggie Nelson fan, and so part of me wanted sort of more expansiveness about what this ordinary devotion means in terms of Maggie Nelson's usage of it, and how it feeds into the larger theme of the essay that Erin's talking about, explaining that ordinary devotion is one in the context of parenthood. Or a question that I had to sort of follow up on that was just wondering whether using it in that context might sort of be limiting it in a certain way, or whether Erin wanted to specifically engage with ordinary devotion outside of motherhood.
This is another example of how, even though I wouldn't think of our relationship, mine and Allison's, as a developmental editorial relationship, because Allison saw a fully drafted piece rather than being in company with me as I was writing. This felt like a moment of developmental editing, because it was Allison's editorial questioning that led me to have to make a decision about what the essay was actually about. I thought that my focus was on boredom, but boredom is the foil for thinking about reckoning with aging and motherhood, and reckoning with aging and motherhood as a woman. And so in asking to unpack and not be so shorthanded and quickly moving from one thing to another, and that kind of catalog of sentences and associations and almost magpie mind of picking on the next shiny idea, Allison required me with these careful editorial questions to make really clear for myself in that next draft what in fact the essay was about.
Thinking about that as Erin revisited this paragraph, it's in this paragraph that you talk about becoming pigeonholed as that kind of writer. And especially with discussing that in this piece, there's, maybe this line that you're walking as you were drafting it, that like, how much do you lean into the topic of motherhood, and how much do you keep that in the periphery or something?
The person who read a draft of this long before I sent it anywhere, and the only, Brick was the place that I wanted to put it if I was going to put it anywhere, was my friend, the writer Johanna Skibsrud, who said to me, "Oh yeah, we worry, don't we, about being pigeonholed as those kind of writers?" And she was referring specifically to being mothers who found ourselves attending to, air quotes, smaller things or domestic things, which is something that Sina Karas, in a totally different context, writes about all the time, the ways in which the domestic and the emotional labor and the creative process get constantly obfuscated. And so this was a moment absolutely where I was grappling with, is the thing ready to be read and to move out of yourself into the world? And so some of those early questions asking me to clarify something that to me felt citational, Maggie Nelson, go do the reading, became also central to kind of the thrust and the sort of the emotional tenor of the whole piece. Let's imagine it's interesting to think about boredom, the particular boredom of childhood, vague, a bit listless, on the precipice of possibility, where time is expansive and anything and nothing might pique one's curiosity, or it might not. The kind of boredom in which afternoons are eternal. When I try to recall the boredom and aimlessness of childhood, I find mostly hazy memories hovering on the horizon of my synapses, the feeling of sun through an open window, the fug of ancient blankets spread over chairs to make a fort, cicadas, grass drying in the heat, June bugs hitting the screen. What is it about expansive time and summer? No school, probably. Though surely I was bored at other times, it was always summer, boredom that was visceral. Underwater time. Mornings on a screened porch, the ancient Naugahyde glider creaking as I tap my foot. Afternoons spent swimming, swimming, swimming. Evenings that stretch past dinner, the hum of mosquitoes thickening as the sun fades. Almost always I am alone in these memories. There is never television. There are often books which I have finished and the feeling of almost sleep or near frustration. As I enter my 40th year, I find myself recalling these moments more and more. This is not nostalgia. It is something else. I think it has to do with time. Now let's imagine that other kinds of boredom can be interesting. Take, for example, the boredom of ordinary devotion in Maggie Nelson's terms. She's borrowing from D.W. Winnicott, who maintains that if devotion was an important developmental step in the work of mothering, then a lack of devotion, the ability simply to provide care without getting too gummed up, without feeling ruined, was also crucial. So let us imagine that the ordinary devotion of care is also boring, at least in part. I think, too, that this has to do with the expansiveness of time, but here that expanse is accounted for in small acts of giving care. The time of rocking, of holding, of the crick in the neck that comes from falling asleep that way, of the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 count, and the slow breath before going again for the 5th time to soothe. Of toddlers' incessant questions, of hoping for 10, just 10 minutes alone, and then attaining them and being at a loss. But also, this is about the familiar shape of a day, of a life I built. How boring this time is, how banal, and yet how risky to say so. I am a bit restless, I admitted in hushed tones to an acquaintance in the early months of new motherhood. I was quieted with a look of disapproval. Then later, I overheard a whisper, she must have postpartum depression. Perhaps I did. Perhaps there are gradations of boredom around motherhood, and not all of them are negative. When one is interested in these creatures and their growing habits, one is devoted. When one is interested in writing about these creatures, one becomes pigeonholed as that kind of writer. I'm a sloppy first draft writer, I think. So usually the editors that I work with have really excellent points to make that need to be attended to. In this particular essay, though, I was committed to a word. The word was emerge, and I was committed to it and said so. I said to Allison when she came back to me and said, there's been some conversation amongst the editorial board around this particular word. People didn't recognize it. Would you like to change it? And I thought about it. And I thought about it partly because Allison offered the interrogative, how do you feel about this? What do you think about these responses? And I found myself thinking, no, this is the hill I'm dying on. This word stays. And the word needed to stay because I was speaking about my partner's mother, who worked for years in Emerge in Amherst, Nova Scotia. And that is a very specific, everybody talks about Emerge. It has nothing to do with emergence. It is entirely the way that you talk about the emergency room. And that's very specific. So if I'm committed to something, I'll have to notice it in myself, but I'll also explain my commitment. There are other times that my own colloquialisms don't land with the reader at all. In a book that I was writing some years ago, called Notes from a Feminist Killjoy, I wanted to talk, and we got to the final draft, and I have this sort of piece where I'm talking about the time of writing the book, and I wrote it in what I was referring to as snatches of time. And my editor kind of came back to me and said, "So tiny vaginas of time is when you wrote this?" And I thought, oh no, that's nope. So we now have pockets of time in there, or something like that, right? So that was one where I thought, okay, no, this is not landing with the reader. It doesn't make sense to anyone but me. It has weird or maybe distracting associations. In that case, it's got to change, even if it makes sense in my own head.
It seemed to me like such an important word in the piece. It's what sort of immediately came to mind as this kind of sense of wanting to vouch for the author's usage and the voice of a character that is a real person in their life, and how they frame the everyday happenings for themselves. I think switching that just is so relevant, and just because something is regional doesn't mean it's sort of out of reach for the average reader.
Who knew we were going to talk about emerge so much, and yet how could we not? Because for me, working with Allison was a joy, not only for the details and the specificity of the questions that she asked that we looked at in the close reading, but also because it felt like Allison was thinking with me and meeting me not only at the structure of the essay, but where I was coming from as a writer. It felt that she was there in the atmosphere that I was working with. And her queries were always genuine. They felt aimed very much at pulling out the best writing onto the page, rather than that kind of slash and burn editorial process in which the editor needs their voice or ideas in the piece, or probably more likely is thinking about a general readership and thinking about kind of shifting the tone or shifting the pitch to a more general readership. And so this exchange around the phrase, the regional phrasing for emergency room, was so important, because I was talking about an experience that wasn't my own, but was my partner's mother's experience, in a catalog of thinking about the different gradations and different experiences of boredom that included a dear friend of ours who's from rural Newfoundland, and the kind of boredom of waiting for the ferry in Port aux Basques. Also not my experience, but a very particular kind of existence inside that ecosystem of boredom. And so these needed to be words that were there specifically, because emerge in Amherst is different than the ER in Ottawa, and it's different than an ER in downtown Toronto or Sackville, New Brunswick. And so this became another moment in which it felt very much as though my editorial relationship with Allison was one of really wanting the best for the piece, and for the piece to be marked as mine.
That means so much to me. Thanks. This piece is so beautiful. It's so nice to revisit it.